you know, the cutting edge of the current argument for design concerns the remarkable fine-tuning of the universe for the existence of intelligent, interactive life. Here's a simple formulation of the teleological argument based on the fine-tuning of the universe. Premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance. 3, therefore, it is due to design. Now, with respect to premise 1, perhaps I'd better explain to our audience what is meant by fine-tuning. This expression does not mean designed. Otherwise, the argument would be obviously circular, claiming that the best explanation of design is design. Rather, during the last 50 years or so, scientists have discovered that the existence of intelligent, interactive life anywhere in the cosmos depends upon a delicate and complex balance of initial conditions simply given in the Big Bang itself. If nature's fundamental constants and quantities were to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, this life-permitting balance would be destroyed, and no living, interactive organisms of any kind could exist anywhere in the cosmos. Now, you recognize the fact of fine-tuning, don't you? Yes, Sir Martin Rees has done a very good job of describing this remarkable fine-tuning of the universe. Good. Now, premise 1 simply lists the 3 possibilities for explaining the presence of this amazing fine-tuning: physical necessity, chance, or design. Are you aware of any other explanations? Good. Then these are our 3 alternatives. And the question then is, which is the best explanation? Well, premise 2 addresses that question. The first alternative, physical necessity, is extraordinarily implausible because the values of the constants and quantities are independent of the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values for these constants and quantities. Right? Sir Martin Rees does reject this first alternative. And you agree with him about that. Good. We're making progress. You know, it's so nice to be talking with you about these things, Professor Dawkins. So what about the second alternative, that the fine-tuning of the universe is due to chance? Well, it seems to me that the problem with this alternative is that the odds against the universe's being life-permitting are so incomprehensibly great that they cannot be reasonably faced. So, to increase the chances of fine-tuning, you're prepared to postulate an infinite number of randomly ordered, unseen universes, composing a sort of world ensemble or multiverse of which our universe is but a part. Right. And somewhere in this infinite world ensemble, finely tuned universes will appear simply by chance alone, and we happen to be one such world. Yes, it does appear to be, how did you put it, an unparsimonious extravagance. So how do you respond to that objection? Now, let me get this straight. You say that if each one of these universes is simple in its fundamental laws, then we are still not postulating anything highly improbable. Well, now, Dr. Dawkins, that response just seems to me to be confused. In the first place, each universe in the ensemble is not simple, but it's characterized by an array of contingent quantities and constants. If each universe in the ensemble were simple, then why did you feel the need to postulate the world ensemble in the first place? Secondly, you're assuming that the simplicity of the whole is a function of the simplicity of the parts. And that's just an obvious mistake. Think, for example, of a complex mosaic, say a mosaic of a Roman face. A complex mosaic is made up of a great number of individually simple parts, little chips of blue and green and brown, for example. The parts are simple, but the whole is complex. And in exactly the same way, an ensemble of simple universes will still be complex if those universes are randomly ordered in their constants and quantities, rather than, say, all having the same values. Look, here's what I think you need to say. You can argue that the postulate of a world ensemble is still simple if there is a single, simple mechanism generating the many worlds. So the question is, what mechanisms do you suggest for generating this infinite, randomly ordered world ensemble? An oscillating model of the universe. So the idea here is that the universe has undergone an infinite series of expansions and contractions, and that each time it expands, it gets a new array of constants and quantities until finally a finely tuned universe emerges by chance alone. Right. Well, let me just ask you this. Are you familiar, Dr. Dawkins, with the many difficulties facing oscillatory models of the universe which have caused contemporary cosmologists to be skeptical of them? Well, all right, never mind. You can find the references in my book, Reasonable Faith. Here's the fundamental point, however. Even if the universe could oscillate from eternity past, such a universe would require an infinitely precise fine-tuning of its initial conditions in order to persist through an infinite series of cycles. So the mechanism you're proposing is not simple. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It is fine-tuning of an infinitely precise variety. Moreover, such a universe involves a fine-tuning of a very bizarre sort because the initial conditions have to be set at minus infinity in the past. But how can that be done if there never was a beginning? Oh, okay, you've got other possible mechanisms. Okay, what's that? Oh my goodness, Lee Smolin's evolutionary cosmology. All right, let me explain to our audience that according to this conjecture, black holes are portals to baby universes being birthed by ours. Universes which produce lots of black holes will therefore produce lots of offspring and therefore have an evolutionary advantage over time. Now, since black holes are the result of star formation, and stars favor planets where life can evolve, the unintended effect of evolutionary cosmology is to make life-permitting universes more probable. Well, Dr. Dawkins, there are numerous problems with Lee Smolin's evolutionary cosmology, but the fatal assumption in the theory was his assumption that universes which produce lots of black holes also produce lots of stable stars. In fact, it turns out that the exact opposite is true. The most proficient producers of black holes will be universes which form primordial black holes prior to star formation, so that life-permitting universes would actually be weeded out by Lee Smolin's evolutionary cosmology. So it turns out that Smolin's scenario would actually make the existence of a life-permitting universe even more improbable. Do you have anything else to suggest? No. Well, neither of the ones that you've suggested is even tenable, much less simple. So I guess you haven't shown that your postulation of a randomly ordered world ensemble isn't an unparsimonious extravagance. But are you aware, Professor Dawkins, that there are even worse problems with the world ensemble hypothesis? Well, your colleague, Roger Penrose at Oxford University, has shown that if our universe is just a member of a randomly ordered world ensemble, then it is inconceivably more probable that we should be observing an island of order no larger than our solar system. In fact, the most probable observable universe is one in which a single brain fluctuates into existence out of the quantum vacuum and observes its otherwise empty world. Observable universes like those are simply vastly more plentiful in the world ensemble than finely tuned worlds like ours, and therefore ought to be observed by us if we are just a random member of a world ensemble. Since we don't have such observations, that fact strongly disconfirms the world ensemble hypothesis. On atheism, at least, it is therefore highly probable that there is no world ensemble. You haven't. Well, you really ought to read Roger Penrose's book before you write on these things. So it follows from our premises that therefore the best explanation of the fine-tuning is design, unless the design hypothesis can be shown to be even more implausible than its rivals. So, do you have any objections of comparable weight to the design hypothesis? You do. Wow, the central argument of your book. Go ahead, make my day. Who designed the designer? That's it? That's supposed to outweigh all of the objections against the world ensemble hypothesis. Well, it seems to me that that question has no weight at all, Professor Dawkins. It comes down to this, basically. In order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. This is an elementary point in the philosophy of science. For example, if archaeologists digging in the ground were to discover things looking like arrowheads and pottery shards, they would be justified in inferring that these artifacts were not the chance result of metamorphosis and sedimentation, but were the result of an unknown group of people, even if they had no explanation of who these people were or where they came from. Or again, if astronauts were to discover a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, they would be justified in inferring that this was the product of intelligent agents, even if they had no idea whatsoever who these agents were or how they got there. In order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. In fact, when you think about it, such a principle leads immediately to an infinite regress, so that nothing could ever be explained and science would be destroyed. For before any explanation could be accepted, you'd have to have an explanation of the explanation. But before you could accept that, you'd need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation. But before you could accept that, you'd need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation of the explanation. And before you could accept that, and so on. Nothing would ever be explained. So, in the case of the fine-tuning, in order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation, you don't need to be able to explain the designer. Whether the designer has an explanation can be simply left an open question for future inquiry. What? If the designer is God, then the designer is just as complex as the thing to be explained, and so no explanatory advance is made. But Dr. Dawkins, you ought to realize, as a scientist, that simplicity is not the only criterion that scientists use in assessing rival explanations. Things like explanatory power, explanatory scope, and so forth are equally or more important. A hypothesis which has great explanatory scope might be more complex than a rival explanation, but still be preferred because it explains more things. Simplicity is not the only or even the most important criterion for assessing competing theories. But leave that point aside. The more fundamental mistake that you're making is the assumption that God is just as complex as the universe. That's plainly false. As a pure mind or consciousness without a body, God is a remarkably simple entity. A mind or a soul is not a physical object composed of parts, and therefore it is startlingly simple. Now, certainly a mind may have complex ideas. It might be thinking of the infinitesimal calculus, for example. But a mind itself is a remarkably simple entity, not being composed of parts. You've obviously confused a mind's ideas, which may indeed be complex, with a mind itself, which is a remarkably simple entity. And therefore, postulating a divine mind behind the cosmos most certainly does represent an advance in simplicity, for whatever that might be worth. Oh, you've been told this before by philosophers and theologians like Richard Swinburne and Keith Ward. If only you'd listen to them. So, to sum up, of the three alternatives before us, physical necessity, chance, or design, the most plausible explanation of the cosmic fine-tuning is design.